Hello and welcome to the Whirly Bloke channel. Today I'm going to be doing a full build log of this 110mm brushed quadcopter called the Nanobot. About 6 to 8 months ago, the whole tiny whoop craze kicked off. These are just small quads and starting at a range of about 80mm. I built one and I was a little bit disappointed. It didn't have all the things that I thought it had. Okay, it was small and you could fly it around the house. Great for flying when the weather's really poor. A lot of other quads came out about a similar sort of size as the QX85, the QX90. However, all the ones that I saw I was never fully happy with, so I thought this is a good opportunity to design my own. How hard could it be? Well, as it turns out, it's much harder than I thought it was. But this is what we've ended up with. It's a 110mm carbon fibre frame. It doesn't have any standoffs. It has a TPU printed inner body and some vanity panels and a fairly simple way of mounting the motors that has lots of advantages. I'll just show you quickly some of the reasons I've designed this in the way I have, and then we'll go on and do a full build. I've had a great time designing this. It was much harder than I thought, to be honest. And my hat goes off to anybody who's designed bigger, more complex quads. So the frame of this is made from 1.5mm 3K carbon sheet with a twill weave and a matte finish. And I found that some of the quads that use carbon, like the Whisper quad, they use 1mm carbon to save weight. It's just too thin. You get too many oscillations. The arms are just too flexible. The 1.5mm makes a huge difference. The distance between the motors is 110mm. I found with a bit of experimentation that I wanted this to be 100mm when I first started designing it, but I found it very difficult to tune out the wobble that you get. You can tune it so it flies great indoors, but if you go outside and it's a slight bit of wind, or when you're descending fairly quick, you get a really nasty wobble that no matter how much tuning you do, you just can't get rid of. And I think it's just simply the physical limitations of having something so small with brushed motors that aren't as powerful as the brushless equivalent. What you end up doing is cranking up the D term quite a lot, and that means you just end up with very hot motors. I found that going to 110mm had two advantages. The first being it doesn't have that same sort of oscillation, but also it means it can accommodate the 65mm props, which I really wanted, because these are great for cruising around. You get a nice long flight time. You can still do the acro and stuff, and if you really want to make something that's got more power, you can easily put smaller props on, and you could go for the Spintech or the Micromotor Warehouse motors. But to be honest, these simple Hubsan 8.5mm by 20mm motors are incredibly cheap. They're almost as powerful as the expensive ones, and they're less than a quarter of the price. And to be honest, it doesn't matter how much you pay for a motor, you'll find that some of them, after about 20 or 30 flights, they start to get a bit sticky, and you find that you put the throttle on, you arm it, and the motor won't turn. It needs a bit of a kick, and that's pretty much just because the brushes are wearing out. You can decide what you want to do, but I find these cheaper motors work more than well enough unless you want to start going racing in them. The other thing I wanted was a body like this. I didn't want standoffs. So this is a 3D printed body. It comes in two parts. Base part to accommodate flight controller and receiver, whatever you want. The top part is just a vanity panel. The front part of this is designed to take any of the all-in-one FPV camera systems. Because it's made of TPU, it will absorb some of the vibrations, but it also allows you to insert whatever you like in here, and if you want to cut this down in size with cutters or with a knife, that's fine. You can fix it in very easily with a bit of double-sided foam, but I find actually that the way that this front part has been designed allows you to pretty much fit any of the modern style VTX all-in-one cameras. One of the other important things is that the motor mounts have been designed to solve a number of problems. One is, if you look at some of the quad designs where the motors are mounted into grommets or holders at the top here, they sit up quite high. The fulcrum is further away from the disc of the motor and you can get more vibrations. Secondly, you've got some nice little landing feet which are great. Also, having the protection underneath here actually means that the bottoms of these motors are protected. One of the problems is that the way that the bottom part of the motor is connected to the main body of the motor, they're quite vulnerable. They can break off if you have heavy landing, so it's good to have that protection there. Also, when you're putting props on here, you need to make sure that the prop is mounted all the way down as far as it can go. If you get a heavy landing upside down, it can push the armature out the bottom of the motor. There's lots of room in here. You could fit in a flight controller and a separate receiver board if you want. Personally, I prefer the all-in-one approach, but I've had a prototype of this running with an F3 flight controller that drives brushed motors, and I've had a standard FRSKY X4R in there, and you get tremendous range. If you want to use a single board, all-in-one solution, you can mount it on here with some double-sided foam or an elastic band. If you want to cut this down, you can cut these down just with a knife or some cutters to mount it down a bit lower. You can, however you want to make it work. Just looking on this example, the built-up one, you'll notice that the wires for the motor go down between the motor and the motor mounts. And it's designed to be a tight fit, but not so tight that it will strip the wires. One thing I have seen on some of these frame designs is that the wires come out the bottom here and go through a small hole to the top side of the frame that you can then solder onto your flight controller board. The problem with that is quite simply that any wires that you put through holes in carbon frames will end up with the insulation coming off, because the edges of the carbon fibre are actually pretty sharp. Well, they're abrasive really more than sharp. And lastly, I really wanted something that I quite like the look of. Just having the 3D printed TPU showing through the gaps in the top frame and the main body, I just like the look of. I didn't want it to look like it was just thrown together. So there we go. These come in red and green at the moment, and I shall be doing more if people want them. I'll leave links to where you can buy these kits and any other components which I'll be using in the build. And if you've got a better way of building these, please let me know. It's always great to know how other people do things. So let's get on to the build. Okay, so here we have the basic frame kit. All pretty straightforward, it's not too much in here. Let's see what we've got. So we have the frame kit itself, which is just two parts. It's the main frame. This is made out of 3K twill carbon fibre, 1.5mm, not the usual 1mm, so it's actually pretty stiff. This is a matte finish, and there's a top plate to go on here as well. This is all pretty straightforward stuff, but I just thought I'd show you what was in the box. So we have got some silicone elastic bands. There's actually 5 of those in there. And then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10 2x6, 2.6 self-tapping screws. You only need 8, but there's 2 in there as spares, just in case you lose one. These are the main body parts and the motor mounts and landing legs, they all combined. So let's get this together. It's very simple. The main body part fits on the frame with 4 self-tapping cap head screws. Best thing to do is not to screw these in all the way to start off with. Mainly just to locate the body parts. And as you can see, there's no standoffs required in this build. Everything is printed and contained in the main body parts. Okay, that's all good. Just tiny, it doesn't need to be very tight. Self-tapping screws just locate nicely into the body part. Like that. There we go. All looks very nice with the green showing through. These are available in red as well. And you can clearly see where the all-in-one camera fits in here, which I found doesn't need any additional packing, maybe just a piece of double-sided foam pad at the bottom. While we're here, we showed how I arranged the elastic bands. There's 3 noggins on here that you can use to hold the elastic bands. I put 2 across the outside there, and those will restrain the battery underneath. And then the flight controller that I put in here is an all-in-one flight controller, which I'll show you in the next step. But there's pretty much room for whatever you want in here. You can stick that down with a double-sided pad. I tend to put a double-sided pad underneath, but then just put an elastic band on top. Makes it very quick to change. Okay, so that's the bottom part. A top mount just has a vanity panel that sits underneath. It's there for decoration, nothing else, but I quite like the look of it. You could leave it off and save yourself probably half a gram in weight, but it's entirely up to you. Again, just put the screws through the holes. It's easiest to do this by just getting them through the hole into the vanity plate there, vanity panel, just so they're sticking through like that. You'll see when you get this that there's 2 sides to these 3D printed parts. They're printed on glass, so one side is very shiny, the other side has a slightly rougher feel to it. I tend to put the shiny part on the outside so it shows through the holes. There we go, and simply locate that onto the built-in standoffs and nip it down. Just like that. You could put any of the brushed motor controllers in here, and there's even room to put an FRSKY X4R in there if you want to. If you want to cut down, if this is too high and you want to cut down these, you can just snip these off with a pair of cutters to make it a little bit lower. Entirely up to you. But I think the actual proportions of this look pretty good. And these are the motor mounts. Well, they're actually a bit more than just a motor mount. Mounting the motors down as low as possible in line with the flight controller gives you the best stability. So these serve a few purposes. One, they hold the motor, and they've got a few holes in just to make sure that the temperature doesn't build up too much. And they afford some protection to the brushed motors, because they're not very strong underneath. And you've got some landing legs so that you don't actually have to land on the battery. It's a little bit more stable. So what everybody needs to know is, what does it weigh? Okay, that's zeroed, set on there. It's 16.5 grams. And you might be able to save a little bit of weight by taking the vanity panel off, but this is actually pretty good. It's under my target weight that I wanted it to be. Now there's any number of ways that you can restrain the cable that's going to run through here. You could use a piece of tape. I like to use some heat shrink, which just slots over there. You can easily cut that off, and if you're changing a motor, you're going to be pulling the motor out anyway, so you can just slide a new piece on, and I just think it looks neater. So the way to put this motor on, this is the clockwise motor. Make a small loop in the cable like that. And that will actually stop the cables pulling up or pulling out of the bottom here. So that motor mount just pushes into the frame. At the bottom here there is a hole to allow you to push the old motor out if you need to, without putting any stress on the bottom of the motor. And you just push it in like this, nice and simply. Like I say, don't be tempted to push on the motor spindle, because you will actually push the armature out the bottom. And you can see there's a little loop in here. Just press down nice and gently, like that. Very simple. And these aren't going to jump out when you're flying. It's a nice tight fit. As I said, if you need to change the motors out, you can simply push the motor out from the bottom through the hole without damaging the wires. We're going to be soldering these directly onto the board, so we can cut off those connectors, they're not needed. Cables can pass through the heat shrink like that. And again, I tend not to like to twist the wires, because will generate a little bit of heat, which you don't really need. There we go. I'll heat shrink this on after I've soldered them on. So we've just got 3 more to do, and I'll come back when that's done. So we are just getting the last of the motors in. Remember, can't emphasise enough, make a little loop of wire at the bottom there, so as it pushes in, it doesn't pull the wires out of the bottom of the motor. Pushed in. So it's a firm fit. Press down till it hits the bottom. So the inside, the way this is printed, it may not look like it from here, but it's carefully designed at the bottom, so there's a ridge to hold the bottom of the motor. Then when you've got them all in, just push those through there. We'll heat shrink those up when we've finished. Just make sure, double check that the motors are pushed down to the bottom, that they're all straight. They should be vertical. You may have pushed it in just slightly at an angle. As you can see, this is pretty stiff. This is why I didn't like some of those other small quads. Now, one thing I like to do before I start soldering everything, we're only going to make, what, 10 solder joints on here? But it's extremely annoying if you've gone through that and gone through all the setup of the flight controller to find that one of the motors isn't working for whatever reason. So I like to just quickly test each of these motors. Very simple. Just strip the wires. Red's positive, blue's negative. To be honest, it doesn't really matter. It's the wrong way if you connect it the wrong way around. And just push them down onto the battery connector. And I can hear that one spinning up, that's great. On the anti-clockwise motor, white is positive and black is negative. Yep, that's good. Perfect. So we know all motors are working, they're all nicely located, and we can start thinking about getting the flight controller in and getting them soldered up. I've built a few of these up now using various flight controllers, ranging from the FRSKY, which is Spectrum all-in-one receiver, ESCs and flight controller. I've built some that have got separate flight controllers, and I've used an FRSKY X4R, which gives you all the telemetry. There's all ways you can do it. My favourite board at the moment, this is one from Eachine. Basically, this is an F3 Evo brushed flight control board. I got this from Banggood. It's got a built-in FRSKY SBUS 8-channel receiver, and it has got the ESCs, or the motor drive. They're not really ESCs, well, they are ESCs, but the motor drive is built in. It's got a small receiver, aerial. The range is pretty good. It weighs, well, let's have a look, practically nothing. This is all you need. That and some soldered in and a battery, and away you go. Let's have a look. I'll leave links to all these components. Let's have a look. Okay, so that weighs 2.6 grams, which is incredible. In terms of price, these are about £22 in the UK. These come flashed with Clean Flight, which works, but they still exhibit some nasty wobble, which I'll talk about a little bit later. I found Betaflight works particularly well, and I'll go through exactly how we flash Betaflight onto here. It's really straightforward. This is using the STM32F303 72 meg processor, and obviously got a gyro built in. You can run this off anything up to 4.2 volts, so you can connect a 1S cell directly to here without any problems at all. I like to tin all the connections that we're going to make onto the board before we even mount it, and before we do any setup in Clean Flight or Betaflight. We'll just need power pretty much, so let's go ahead and do that. Nice clean iron. There we go. So this is the cable that came with the flight controller. They were pre-tinned, but I'm going to just tin them again because we don't really know what sort of solder was used for that. Just support that there. Ground is this connection here. There we go. A VCC or power is there. Excellent. That's all we need to power this up and get it set up with Clean Flight. But before I do that, I'm just going to make the connection for the FPV camera. This is an Eachine TX03. I particularly like these. It's an all-in-one 200 up to 200 milliwatt switchable. I've previously been using the TX02, which is very good. The only reason I put a connector on here rather than hardwiring it in is if we want to change out the camera for any reason. Check the length on that. The camera's going to sit in the front, so this can actually be pretty short, to be honest. So this is the end that plugs into the camera. We snip that off. It's useful to keep those. And we can strip these wires. and tin them. Very straightforward stuff, this. It may look like it's a fiddly build, but actually it's not. It's quite straightforward to piggyback this onto the connectors where the battery is going to connect. Oh, it's already connected. It's just convenient to do that now. There we go. Nice and neat. And at the same time, I'm going to just tin the connections that we're going to be using on here whilst I'm here. It's a bit difficult to see on here exactly where these are, but basically this is motor 1, motor 2, motor 3, motor 4 connections. The only other connections that I'm going to be using is these two middle ones up here for a buzzer. It might be a bit of extra weight, but these, if you lose one of these in the long grass, you are never going to find it. And for the sake of a gram or two, I'd rather have a buzzer. So let's get those tinned up. And the buzzer connections, there's 4 connections here: ground, buzzer minus, buzzer positive, and I can't remember what the top one is actually. Oh, it's a 3.3 volt. I think that might be an output actually. I'll check. Oops. Not quite enough hot heat. There we go. And we just quickly inspect that to make sure there are no solder bridges. And I find the best way to do this is old toothbrush. It also gets rid of any specks of flux that you might have on there. Remember, flux, you don't want it kicking around. I'll clean this board off properly with some isopropyl alcohol. Before we start programming this board, we've been soldering. There's flux on the board and we want to make sure there's no specks of solder that have just bridged anything. The thing to remember about flux is it's a corrosive chemical. It's designed to get rid of all the oxidants when it heats up. You don't really want it on the board, so I like to just take a clean toothbrush, some isopropyl alcohol, and just clean away any residual flux that's kicking around on the board. That's the end of part 1 of this build log. Part 2 covers setting up the radio, the flight controller and the maiden flight.